my definition of an artist, and I never thought of myself as an artist my whole life long. I've always thought of myself as just a form kid, who was doing what he liked to do. But an artist is someone who is really sensitive to their feelings, really sensitive to all the emotions that pass through your brain and your heart during the day. And an artist is a person who figures out how to express those to those around him. And if you reduce animation to making a movie that will make money or taking home a salary, some of that gets eclipsed. Some of that and the joy that comes from creating the artwork isn't really as grand as if you can actually create. And I find a lot of people, everyone I believe is born to create. You have it in you, and it's scared out of you, or maybe programmed out of you by the school system, by your parents, by the churches, by whatever. It's programmed out of you. And so pretty soon, what I seem to get to meet is artists who are afraid. They're afraid to express their emotions. Maybe they don't even know what they are. Or they're afraid to take chances. They want it safe.
Greetings everyone, and welcome to Film Fables, the new series on my little YouTube channel where I analyze films from both an objective and subjective viewpoint, covering their history and hopefully taking something away from it all by the end. Today we will start our journey going through the history and directorial filmography of one of the most talented, unique, revered, at times controversial, and above all else, important animators and animated film directors of all time, not to mention one of my personal favorites. None other than Donald Virgil Bluth, or just simply Don Bluth as he's more widely known. I'll be going over all of Bluth's films and projects that were chiefly his, from his animated shorts like Banjo the Woodpile Cat, to his video games like that of Dragon's Lair, and through all of his animated films in order of their release. From the man's masterpieces to his cult classics and into his flops. I will be going over their history and analyzing them as films from an objective standpoint, as well as occasionally going into some of my more personal memories associated with some of his films when I get into some of my more subjective feelings about each film. With that said, grab yourself a hot drink, nab a snack or two, and get comfy as we begin the Don Bluth Retrospective. Donald Virgil Bluth was born on September 13th of 1937, the second oldest of 7 children. Don Bluth spent his earliest years in El Paso, Texas. His parents were Emmeline Pratt and Virgil Bluth. Virgil Bluth being a policeman at the time, and later a private investigator. Don Bluth has some well-known lineage and family members, like that of his great-grandfather, who was Helman Pratt, an early leader in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the LDS Church. His second cousin, Mitt Romney, lost the 2012 United States presidential election to Democratic incumbent Barack Obama, to his late younger brother, Toby Bluth, of whom being an illustrator for several cartoons and animated films. As a child in El Paso, Don used to ride his horse into the town movie theater to watch Disney films. Quote, I'd ride my horse to the movie house in town and tie him to a tree while I went in and watched the latest Disney film. Then I'd go home and copy every Disney comic book I could find, unquote. These moments watching Disney films from a young age changed Bluth's life forever after. The spark of creation, a muse that would never die, casted its light upon Don as he sat in those theater seats. Watching the beautiful assortment of colors, characters, stories, animation before him. Quote, I'd say somewhere around 4 years old I saw a picture called Snow White. I think that's the one that got me. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen before. I liked the look of it. I liked the emotional response I had to it. I just liked everything about it. And the name that came immediately after that was Walt Disney. I began, over the years as I was growing up, to have an affinity towards the Disney pictures, and I waited for every one with anticipation for the new delight that had been created. Unquote. At the age of 6, his family moved to Payson, Utah, where he lived on a family farm. Bluth remembered that time as, quote, milking 24 cows morning and night and singing Disney songs, unquote. Even then, he was, quote, mostly dreaming of working, unquote, at Disney Studio. In 1954, Don's family moved to Santa Monica, California, where he attended part of his final year of high school before returning to Utah and graduating from Springville High School. He would later attend Brigham Young University in Utah for 1 year, after which he brought a portfolio to the Disney Studio in Burbank. He was immediately hired in 1955 as an assistant to John Lounsbury, whom worked as an animator for such films like Pinocchio and Fantasia, as well as animation director for such like Dumbo, Song of the South, Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, and Lady and the Tramp up to that point. Bluth played assistant to John Lounsbury on the, at the time, newest animated Disney feature, Sleeping Beauty. However, ultimately, after finally realizing his lifelong dream, Don would leave in 1957 after only 2 years of working at Disney. Quote, I left, I think, because I found it kind of boring. I didn't want to do it, unquote. His actions after his departure reveal more of what might have been his ultimate reasons for leaving Disney, as Bluth would spend the next 2.5 years in Argentina on a mission for the LDS Church. Bluth then returned to the United States, where he opened the Bluth Brothers Theater with his younger brother Fred, while still occasionally working for Disney on the side, notably as an assistant animator for 101 Dalmatians and The Sword in the Stone, though he is uncredited in both cases. Still, his main focus was the Bluth Brothers Theater. Both Don and his brother Fred produced musical plays with local talent for 2 to 3 years. The shows included such traditional favorites as The Music Man and The Sound of Music. Often Don was the musician playing the piano. One attendee stated it was like an old movie musical where kids decide to put on a show in a barn. Don would later finish his degree in English literature, but it seemed that after everything else he had done over those few years, all that he had accomplished, he still was holding on to a dream, the same one that he had since he was just 4 years old. Quote, then you get to your teens and you start saying, what am I going to do when I am of age and I go into the workforce? I kept saying, I think that's what I want to do. I wanted to go to California and work on animated films. I had this drive, absolute drive, and from 4 years old and on, that never really deviated, unquote. Don Bluth went back into animation full-time starting off in 1967, working for Filmation, before finally returning to a full-time position at Disney in 1971. However, things didn't quite feel the same as they did all those years ago. Quote, it was all much different because Walt was gone, Dodd said in 1990. It was a committee running the place. The pictures did not look very good. I was no longer encumbered with that romantic film over my eyes. I could see a little bit more clearly now, unquote. During this period at Disney, Don met Gary Goldman and John Pomeroy. Gary was a recent art school graduate and part of the animation training program at Disney, while John started working at Walt Disney Animation Studios in 1973 as a background artist and became a full-time animator in 1974 to work on Winnie the Pooh and Tigger 2. The three of them found that they had very similar thoughts on animation, how it ought to be done, and over time became a true team and close friends. Any recounting of Don's career after meeting these two is rather incomplete without them, even if Don is usually credited for most of the stuff that came after, even when these two were still very important. Some have even lovingly named these three men the Three Musketeers of traditional animation. They were all in agreement that things over at Disney had changed for the worst. The industry was changing, using cheaper methods of animation, cutting costs anywhere they could, and the stories they were making just didn't quite have that love and care Don felt was there back when Walt was alive. In their eyes, Disney had lost its namesake and visionary. So starting as far back as 1973, Don, along with Gary and John, and a few other Disney artists began purchasing and collecting the tools of their trade, and undertook the enormous task of writing, directing, and producing their own animated film in secret in Don's garage, all the while still working for Disney while they slowly completed their passion project. Don would work as a character animator for Disney's Robin Hood, Winnie the Pooh, and Tigger 2, as well as the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh. Don would then be given a far more substantial leadership role over the 1977's The Rescuers, working as animation director for said film, and would be given the same role for Pete's Dragon, released later that same year. Then, finally, Don would have his first chance in the director's seat in the animated short, The Small One, which could have marked a turning point, allowing the new, younger animators a chance to reinvigorate the studio, influenced by the quality of production and animation that Walt had established long before. However, as Don tried to include costlier production values reminiscent of early Disney films, special effects, and more color, he was swiftly denied. Don was so crestfallen with the current regime and its focus on cost reduction at this point that he asked to step down as producer and director of the short to focus on animating the short instead.
Small one, don't look so blue. Somewhere a friend is waiting for you.
The Small One, based on the book by Charles Tazewell of the same name, follows a son of a woodcutter and his old pet donkey named Small One, who can't quite keep up with the bigger donkeys, isn't able to do the work that they are able. The boy is sent out to town to sell the donkey off since they can no longer keep up with the upkeep for a donkey that does no work, much to the dismay and heartbreak of the boy. The rest of the film, the two go on an adventure through the town, trying to find Small One a good home. The only one interested in such a small little donkey, however, is the local tanner, while everyone else simply mocks the donkey and shuns and looks down on him. By nightfall, the two of them have run out of options, the boy knowing that he is not allowed to come back home until he sells the donkey off. In the end, however, a kind man by the name of Joseph buys the donkey off of the boy, telling him that he needs the donkey to help his wife Mary on their way to Bethlehem. The short story ends with Small One helping to deliver the Christmas miracle, aiding in the delivery of Jesus Christ. Even if this is Don's directorial debut, it's hard to say how much of that is in name only, so I'll save that side of the retrospective for the films coming up. What's interesting about this short from a purely animation level, however, is the contrast between certain scenes. There are moments when animation from Mowgli from the 1967 Jungle Book are clearly used to cut corners, the animation being recycled, whereas a scene later on in the short where the boy is trying to sell Small One to a horse auction, the animation is far smoother, bouncier, and on an objective level, just a step above the animation animation in the rest of the short, and furthermore has Don's distinct style, his signature, if you will. Something we'll explore in more detail a bit later. There were rumors going around that Don was giving the best parts of the short to be animated by himself, as well as his team that were working on their passion project, while the cost-cutting parts were given to the animators he saw as Disney loyalists. Tensions were rising by the day, to say the very least. The short itself was released theatrically on December 16th of 1978, alongside a reissue of Walt Disney's 1940 Pinocchio. The short is a sweet little story that, while not at all complex, makes for a great Christmas short that has a few distinct tearjerker moments that, while I'm not totally sure was Don's doing, is certainly a telltale sign of his work in the director's chair. While I don't have any particular history with this short, I can say that the whole thing is fairly well made, and even has a few shots, like that of the final shot in the short, that has stuck with me after watching it. However, in the background of all this, Don and his team were still working on their passion project over the last 4.5 years. And its time in the limelight would soon follow. Quote, people thought we used the garage on purpose, because Walt Disney started in a garage, but we weren't that shrewd. We simply couldn't afford any place else. My living room had blackout curtains set up and was the projection room. My family room was the camera room. My bedroom had editing equipment in it for years, and the kitchen and patio were the commissary. Any money we had, we put into the filmmaking equipment and things that show on the screen, unquote. Don, Gary, and John and their crew, after 4.5 long years of late nights and weekends dedicated to their passion project. The featurette was finally finished in 1979, Don Bluth's first film to call his own, entitled Banjo the Woodpile Cat. The short follows the adventures of Banjo, a curious, mischievous, and rebellious young orange kitten living in a woodpile on a farm in Payson, Utah, in the year 1944. Banjo gets into all sorts of trouble around the barn, to which his sisters, Emily and Jean, tell on him, to which his father scolds him time and time again. This all leads to Banjo's father finally having enough and telling Banjo to go and get a switch for him to give him a whooping with. Banjo feels misunderstood and upset with his family, and decides on his way to go and get a switch to run away from home, hitching a ride on a feed truck to Salt Lake City. However, as Banjo soon finds out, the city is full of both excitement and danger around every corner. He eventually begins to get homesick, and as he gets lost in the great big city, admits to himself that he misses his family, that he needs them, and that he took them for granted. All seems lost until a big cat by the name of Crazy Legs finds Banjo and offers to help him find his way back home. Along the way, they meet up with a cat singing trio by the names of Cleo, Melina, and Zazu in a nightclub, and enlist them for help in finding the truck Banjo came in on. In the midst of the search, Banjo and Crazy Legs are chased by a pack of violent dogs and barely escape with their lives. As the night comes to a close, Banjo and Crazy Legs take refuge with Zazu, all of them worried if they'll be able to find Banjo's truck home. Crazy Legs prays that night for a miracle, and the next morning the truck is right outside their home. Banjo says goodbye to Crazy Legs and Zazu's lot and makes his way back home to his family, the short ending on what is presumably Christmas Day, all of them together again. The story of the short is partly based on one of Don Bluth's childhood memories whilst living on a farm. According to Don, the Bluth's family cat, who lived in a woodpile nearby, suddenly disappeared for several weeks, only to return and stay there after. The short itself features some beautiful pieces of animation, with Banjo's first arrival into Salt Lake City, Crazy Legs' emotive face and general movement, and a especially the dog chase scenes standing out as some truly breathtaking stuff. Especially when you consider the shoestring budget of this short and how few people were working on it at a time. And yet even more so when you consider that Don and his peers working on this short insisted on working on the animation the hard way, the older way, the way that wasn't as cost effective, but as seen by many, was objectively better. To better understand the crux of the issue that they had with the animation over at Disney, you first need to understand how the animation at Disney was done up until the 1959 film Sleeping Beauty. See, animation for a long time was done primarily through the time-consuming process of tracing the artist's drawings and hand-painting and inking, frame by frame on acetate cells. So every frame needed to be drawn on paper, traced and inked on an acetate cell, and then finally painted for every single frame of animation. This process of animation took a ton of manpower to produce in a timely manner, and thusly, a lot of money. This process was done for years up until the 1959 film Sleeping Beauty flopped at the box office, resulting in huge losses for Disney. This is a moment in history where the animation department at Disney might have been gone for good, shut down if not for a decision by Walt himself to use a new, far more cost and time effective method, the technique known as xerography. Xerography, or electrophotography, is a dry photocopying technique which could allow the animator's drawings to be copied directly onto the cell, thus cutting the hand tracing and inking totally out of the picture. This technique allowed the cost of production to go down, and is what allowed the animation division of Disney to live on, the first film to use this style of animation being 101 Dalmatians. It should be noted that on a purely personal level, I have no issue with this method of animation. Some of my favorite Disney films use this style of animation, as a matter of fact. I'm one of those weirdos that happen to have a lot of my favorite Disney films come from the dark age of Disney, which began around the time they started using xerography and ended when they eventually stopped in 1988. However, Don, Gary, and John, along with the young animators who had begun to look up to them, felt that this cost-effectiveness was at the cost of two much more important things. One being the animation quality, with a lot of animation coming out fuzzier, more stilted, and having a distinct sketchy style because of it. But, much more important is perhaps the cost this method brought overall, the end of innovation. No longer was Disney making the way for animation in the film industry, but instead keeping up with whatever they could just to make some money. Don and his team felt that the executives at Disney weren't interested in taking risks anymore, that the animation just needed to be the bare minimum, that recycling animation was perfectly fine to cut down on costs, but also encouraged, and that this in turn was turning many artists and animators over at Disney to become dependent on said methods. This feeling was pushed even more as Don tried his best to pitch new ideas to the then studio head, Ron W. Miller, and was promptly turned down at every single turn. As stated before, Don's first directorial role, the small one, was quickly pushed out of his hands by the higher-ups. Originally, Banjo the Woodpile Cat was actually pitched to Ron W. Miller as a future film of sorts for Disney, but was immediately turned down, Miller himself saying, quote, "no value in the idea." During the filming stage, Banjo the Woodpile Cat was originally planned out as a feature-length film. The full-length version of the short would have ended up quite different from the short that was eventually released. It included a full-fledged villain, a scarred cigar-smoking cat named Rocco, who bears similarities to characters Don would use in his later films, such as Warren T. Cat from An American Tale and Carface Carthers from All Dogs Go to Heaven. There would have been a termite that saves Banjo from a group of young children in Salt Lake City as well. The tone of the film was originally going to be far darker and would have featured a climactic battle between Crazy Legs and Rocco, inspired by Disney's The Jungle Book's finale between Bear Baloo and Tiger Shere Khan. However, the team found that padding the film out and adding darker elements did not strengthen the storyline, so the filmmakers kept the film as a short. Though I must admit that this version of the film sounds pretty damn amazing, and honestly better to me. As well it should, since it would later act as a sort of outline, a skeleton if you will, for some of Don's later far larger projects, like that of An American Tail. Another idea that was considered was for the short to be a Christmas special that would have featured live action scenes of Sparky Marcus, aka the kid who voices Banjo, talking to Santa Claus, and the animation would have been far more Christmas themed. Don Bluth recalled, quote, "We forced Christmas into it, and it just didn't quite work," unquote. However, Crazy Legs briefly wearing the Santa Claus suit, as well as the wintry landscapes later on in the short, as well as the decorations, are still evident in the final film. The short is full of charm, and with many of what become Don's signature storytelling tropes being seen in full here. A young, optimistic character thrown into a dark and unforgiving place, a kind and lovable pal to help him through that place. The only things missing are perhaps those cut ideas, which would have been a big bad villain, or the darker elements that Don would become more famous for later in his career. I suppose my greatest critique of this short is that it does feel like the outline of a far greater film, something that would be fully realized in the near future. However, if I look at the short without thinking of the great films that would spawn from its skeleton, Banjo the Woodpile Cat is a sweet and well animated short, with some nice lessons for kids, I suppose. Crazy Legs is without a doubt the highlight of the short. He's a kind and jolly sort of character who reminds me a lot of Baloo from the Jungle Book, as well as having the best little song portion of the short.
I'll stick with you, kid, you stick with me. Together we'll overcome adversity. Old man trouble will have to let you be, 'cause you're gonna come out smiling if you stick with me.
Banjo's a fairly realistically written child character as well though, especially in the moments at the start where you see him going to get a Switch for his father to spank him with, feeling bad for himself and thinking his family doesn't care for him, along with his subsequent realization how much he really cared for his family later on when he's in Salt Lake City. But overall, unlike most of Don Bluth's later films, there isn't a lot for me to really bite into as far as analysis or really anything else. It's just what you see is what you get. It's a sweet little short that could have been better, I think, had it been a movie. Though I will say that Banjo's family never going out and searching for him is a rather big issue, maybe a plot hole with the short. Again, I think due to this being a short, they most likely couldn't have added an additional storyline to it. They probably wanted to keep the cost low, but even the ending feels very abrupt. Not much fanfare when Banjo actually does get home. It's rather strange, really. This, however, would have been an interesting plot point, again, had it been a full-length feature, and would have added much more to the emotional payoff. Notably, had there been a moment when Banjo's father meets up with Crazy Legs, something like that would have been pretty cool. Once again, something that would have been realized later on in Don's later films. Salt Lake City is also pretty interesting aesthetically in the short. It is shown to be a big scary place from Banjo's perspective, while from Crazy Legs' perspective the place is what he calls home. Cozy even, besides the dogs of course. The remnants of this short being a Christmas special can still very much be felt, not only through some of the visuals, but it also just sort of has an atmosphere for me on a subjective level. That feeling of a short little animated cartoon you would watch in the evening or late at night in the midst of December. Though I will say that the title song, while cute and well fitting for the short, does get to be a bit much after like the 6th or 7th time it plays in the background during this 24-minute short. In the end, this short was laughed off by Miller and all the other Disney animator loyalists, dubbed the Mouseketeers or the Rat's Nest, as called by those who sided with Don Bluth and his gang. There was a noticeable divide in the company by this point, those who sided with Ron W. Miller and those who sided with Don Bluth. And this short only strengthened that divide, as those who worked on it felt as though they had proved their passion and ideas can be put to good use, perhaps even independently, and those who scoffed at the mere idea of any serious animators not working for Disney. Either way though, Banjo the Woodpile Cat was enough proof to Don, Gary, and John, as well as several other animators working at Disney, that they had the ability to make something on their own without Disney's help. That things were only going to get worse at Disney from here on. A realization that would lead to the most important moment in Don Bluth's life, but also one of the most important moments in Disney and animation history as it stands today. In 1979, Jim Stewart, an ex-Disney executive, hearing that Bluth and Goldman were unhappy at Disney and having taken interest in the short they made, reached out to the two to see if they would be willing to leave Disney and start their own company. It was a fairly easy decision for both of them. Stewart also asked what movie they would want to begin with had they left. Don recalled the Newbery Award-winning youth novel Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim, that he himself had once pitched at Disney as a future film project, but was once again shut down by Ron W. Miller himself over, quote, they had already done a mouse movie, unquote. That mouse movie being the 1977 The Rescuers. Don and Gary eventually informed their fellow animators of the plan and invited them to join in forming a new studio. Then, on September 13th, 1979, on Don's 42nd birthday, and in the midst of the film of The Fox and the Hound being made, Don, Gary, John, and 14 other animators all left Disney suddenly and without any warning to form Don Bluth Productions with financing from Jim at Aurora Productions. An entire third of the Disney animation studio was now gone, leaving The Fox and the Hound to be delayed for a whole year. News soon spread like wildfire as the Disney defectors, as they would come to be known, made a name for themselves, ready to start making animated films the way they wanted, and to go toe-to-toe with the big-eared mouse himself. Starting with a film that would come to define Don Bluth as a director, a film that would usher in a whole new world of animated films to come, and one of my personal favorite animated films of all time, a film entitled The Secret of NIMH.